We always think of love as this emotional bond, right? But what if I told you that one of its strongest pillars, the thing holding it all together, is actually purely economic? Today, we're going to dig into a really fascinating framework that looks at the unspoken financial architecture inside modern relationships, and what happens when that whole structure gets put to the test.
We all know the modern ideal, right? A partnership of equals, the 50-50 split. But what happens when that ideal just gets shattered? When life, or maybe a career, tips the financial scale so far to one side that the balance is completely gone? That's the core question we're unpacking today.
All right, so first up, let's just establish the baseline here, the 50-50 ideal. This is pretty much the cultural script for how a modern partnership is supposed to work. As you can see, the goal is perfect balance. Finances, chores, all the emotional labor, everything split right down the middle. It's an ideal that's really built on this foundation of two equal contributors. But, and this is the key, this very ideal is what sets the stage for a really unique kind of stress test. Okay, so the framework we're looking at today applies a very specific stress test to this ideal. It asks a pretty pointed question. What happens to the relationship stability when those scales tip, and they tip dramatically, and a woman becomes the primary, or maybe even the sole, provider? And that question, well, it leads us right to the core of this whole analysis, the idea of an unseen architecture. The theory is that relationships are built on a lot more than just feelings.
The first pillar of this hidden structure is what's called economic independence. It's really just the simple, practical reality that your combined incomes are what pay for the house, the car, the life that you've built together. This mutual financial need creates a really powerful, tangible incentive to work through problems and stay committed.
So from this point of view, that financial codependence isn't just about money. It actually acts as a kind of scaffolding, an invisible structure that holds the relationship together, especially when things get a little turbulent. It's a pragmatic foundation that exists right alongside the emotional one. Now, the analysis then introduces a second component of this architecture. And this one's a bit more debated. It's called the invisible architecture of attraction. This theory suggests that for some people, attraction is subconsciously linked to more traditional roles, including the idea of a male provider. So according to this framework, when that specific role gets reversed, it can actually challenge a foundational element of the relationship's structure. So these architectural concepts, they build to the central thesis of this whole analysis, which is something called friction against exit.
You can think of it like an economic glue. The idea is simple, but it's really powerful. When leaving a relationship means an immediate and significant drop in your standard of living, you have a very, very strong incentive to stay and work things out. This friction is the direct result of that economic interdependence.
And this slide just lays out the two scenarios perfectly. So on the left, with that economic friction, stability is a mix of love plus financial need. You might have a higher tolerance for your partner's flaws because the cost of leaving, of losing half your income, and completely uprooting your life is just way too high. But then you look to the right, and without that friction, the relationship is judged on its merit alone. The cost of leaving is lower, so the quality of the actual connection has to be that much higher.
Okay, and this is a crucial point. This framework doesn't frame this friction as a bad thing, like you're in a trap. Instead, it's presented as more of a buffer. It's the force that keeps a couple at the table, talking through issues they might have otherwise just walked away from. It basically buys the relationship time to weather storms and find its footing again. And this brings us to the final, critical part of the whole equation. What happens when that friction just vanishes? Well, the relationship then faces an entirely new kind of test. So in our scenario, with the high-earning woman, that economic glue just dissolves. She no longer needs her partner to maintain her lifestyle. The financial cost of leaving drops to zero. The friction against exit is completely gone.
And this is the core insight of this whole framework. Without that economic buffer, the relationship is viewed through a new, much harsher lens. As the quote puts it, small flaws that were once tolerable become deal breakers. Little annoyances that were once easy to overlook when the partnership was a financial necessity, well, now they can suddenly feel like these insurmountable obstacles.
So what are the consequences of this vanishing friction? Well, the relationship is left standing all on its own, tested purely on its own merits. All of that unseen architecture we talked about, the economic interdependence, the traditional provider roles, it all gets stripped away. The partnership is now judged purely on its interpersonal quality, compatibility, respect, affection. The incentive to stay can't be practical anymore. It has to be entirely emotional.
And ultimately, that's the takeaway. When that level of financial independence is achieved by one partner, and particularly by the women in this framework, the relationship is stripped down to its essential core. It now has to stand entirely on its own foundation, without the scaffolding of mutual financial need to prop it up.
And that leaves us with a pretty provocative final question, doesn't it? This framework suggests that true financial independence doesn't just change a person's life, it fundamentally changes the terms of their romantic commitments. It forces a relationship to prove its worth based on merit alone. So you have to wonder, is achieving total financial independence the ultimate test of modern love?